Imagine a judge reading a sentence so long the courtroom shifts in its seats, not because it's shocking, but because it feels impossible. These aren't legends or exaggerations. They're real cases where time itself becomes a punishment, stacked decade after decade until it stops sounding human. People who walked in expecting years walked out carrying entire lifetimes on paper. No sensationalism, no forbidden themes, just the cold mechanics of justice pushing numbers far past what a single life can hold. If you've ever wondered how society deals with crimes that feel too large for a calendar to contain, this is the deep dive you didn't know you needed. Strap in. Number 1. You open your savings book, and the numbers just don't add up. That was Thailand in 1989, when Chamoy Thipiaso's Mae Chamoy pyramid finally snapped. She'd courted status, lured civil servants and military families, and promised impossible yields. The court counted the losses and answered with a number that sounds like a typo: 141,078 years behind bars. Thai law then capped actual time served, about 20 years at the time. But the sentence itself became a warning billboard. Names on the charge sheet, ledgers in boxes, households wiped out. Lesson learned the hard way. When returns look royal, the math is usually treason. Justice translated greed into digits no calculator wants to see. Number 2. A mailbag thumps to the floor. Now multiply by tens of thousands. In 1972, Spanish postman Gabriel March Granados faced a courtroom in Palma de Mallorca for hoarding, dumping, and pilfering mail. Tens of thousands of letters that never reached their people. The judge tallied each count as a slice of time and landed on an almost cosmic figure: 384,112 years. Appeals trimmed reality, of course, but the headline stayed. One of the longest sentences ever recorded for a one-man wrecking ball in a public service. The absurdity worked as intended. Every undelivered letter suddenly had the weight of trust broken. Paper cuts became prison years. Number 3. The blast echoes first. The courtroom numbers come later. For the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, co-conspirator Terry Nichols met two systems: federal and state. Federally, he drew life without parole. Then Oklahoma arrived with its own ledger: 161 consecutive life terms, one for each murdered victim, plus roughly 9,300 extra years for the wreckage left behind. No theatrics, no parole math, just stacked justice, page after page. The arithmetic matters. It says every life counts, and every wound leaves a line in the sentence. In the end, the numbers do what language can't. They quantify the unthinkable and make it unrepeatable. Number 4. A fax machine hums in a plush office, and an insurance fund quietly bleeds. In 2000, financier Sholem Weiss learned what happens when you gut a life insurance company, the National Heritage Life Insurance collapse, and think you can outrun the ledger. A federal judge answered with 845 years, a bricks-and-mortar number for a paper crime. Fraud, RICO, money laundering, and the ruin of thousands of policyholders. Weiss fled, was captured in Austria, and brought back to face the music. Years later, his sentence was commuted in 2021, but the record stands. The court turned spreadsheets into iron bars. When you steal time from retirees, the system can steal time back, by the century. Number 5. Door creaks. Chains rattle. An Oklahoma defendant smiles. His appeal worked. Then the gavel falls harder. Darren Benelford Anderson, convicted of armed robberies and a kidnapping, won a resentencing in the 1990s. The new result: 11,250 years, stacked count by count. A judicial message in bold. He wasn't a headline name, just a man with a pattern of violence, but the math became legend in sentencing lore. Sometimes you roll the dice on a technicality and get an even colder dealer. The figure isn't about living that long, it's about telling future juries and future defendants exactly how seriously the state weighs a gun, a threat, and a terrified victim. Number 6. Picture a courtroom so quiet you can hear the AC buzzing. That's where Billy Wayne White stood when Oklahoma prosecutors stacked his life on paper. 6,000 years for a trail of armed robberies and violent assaults. No theatrics, just charge after charge read aloud, each one adding centuries. White wasn't a mastermind. He was a repeat offender who treated armed holdups like a routine. Jurors saw the pattern, victims described the fear, and the judge made the message unmistakable. Oklahoma law capped how much time he'd actually serve, but the number itself mattered. A reminder that a weapon pointed at a cashier or clerk carries the weight of an entire community. Sometimes the sentence is less about the clock and more about the echo. Number 7. A single door slams in a Tasmanian courtroom and everything goes still. Martin Bryant, responsible for the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, faced a judge who didn't reach for drama, just math. The total, 35 life sentences plus 1,653 years without parole. Australia had already been grappling with gun reform, and Bryant's case accelerated it into permanent legislation. The victims' names were read, the timeline reconstructed, the horror quantified. No parole hearings, no future reviews, no loopholes. Security officers later noted he barely reacted to the length. Reaction belonged to families who wanted the assurance that he would never step outside a cell again. Sometimes the law doesn't negotiate. It locks the door forever. Number 8. Imagine fluorescent lights flickering over stacks of folders. Each one an attack, each one a life changed. Andre Thomas, facing charges for a series of violent murders and assaults in Texas, received a sentence that seemed built from concrete blocks, 2,500 years, added over multiple counts. His case drew national attention not for spectacle, but for the chilling precision of the violence in the record. Prosecutors walked the jury through every scene, and jurors answered with a verdict that removed the question of parole entirely. Every digit in that number is rooted in a victim's testimony, a timeline, a wound. When the court finished reading the sentence, even the air felt heavy. Justice measured in centuries. Number 9. You hear the shuffle of chains before you see him. Juan Corona, convicted in 1971 for murdering dozens of migrant workers in California's agricultural belt, listened as the court issued 25 consecutive life sentences. Investigators had found burial sites across orchards and fields, each one tied back to Corona's labor contracting work. The case shook the region. Men who worked for dollars a day vanished without families able to protest. In the courtroom, prosecutors didn't need grandstanding, just the hard, silent evidence from the soil. The judge's decision ensured Corona would never walk free again. History remembers the body count. The sentence remembers the individual names. Number 10. A movie theater seat sits overturned. Evidence from the 2012 Aurora shooting that prosecutors brought into the courtroom. When James Holmes faced sentencing in 2015, Colorado's judge didn't hand out one decision, but a ledger. 12 life sentences without parole for the murdered victims, plus 3,118 additional years for the wounded and the chaos he caused. Survivors testified not with anger, but with detail. Ringing ears, crawling on the floor, searching for exits. Every story became a line item in the final number. Holmes avoided the death penalty by a single juror's vote, but the resulting decades weren't symbolic. They were structural. The court built a cage from years so numerous they ceased to feel human. Number 11. A guard clears his throat, and the courtroom straightens. Germany's case against Fritz Haarmann, a man who terrified Hanover in the early 1920s, ended with a stark tally: 15 life sentences for a series of proven murders. Police records showed patterns: nighttime disappearances, canal recoveries, the same hunting grounds near the station. Investigators traced clothing, personal items, and witness statements until the picture was unmistakable. Harmon barely reacted when the verdict landed. Prosecutors later said the silence was louder than any outburst. The judge's wording was blunt: society needed protection measured in lifetimes, not years. Sometimes justice speaks through the weight of repetition. Life after life after life. Number 12. A detective slides a single photo across the table. Proof of a killer who didn't hide his crimes well. José Luis Calva Zepeda, arrested in Mexico City in 2007, was linked to several homicides after investigators found evidence inside his apartment. His sentence, 120 years, a number chosen because Mexican law limits cumulative penalties, but still allows symbolic stacking for multiple victims. Reporters noted the eerie calm with which he listened to the verdict. The prosecution focused less on theater and more on forensic detail: timelines, recovered items, matching injuries. Mexico's penal code capped how high the years could climb, but the intent was clear. The state closed every possible door behind him. Number 13. Picture an office printing out extremist pamphlets while a man loads weapons in the back. That was the backdrop to the case of Richard Wayne Snell, tied to white supremacist plots, bombings, and 2 killings in the 1980s. Courts in Arkansas issued consecutive life sentences, supported by FBI testimony and a chain of recovered gear linking him to the crimes. Prosecutors described a man who treated violence as ideology. The sentencing judge emphasized public safety first, symbolism second. Snell sat motionless. Jurors said that was the most unsettling part. The sentence didn't aim for headlines. It aimed for containment. When violence becomes doctrine, the law responds in absolutes. Number 14. A filing drawer slams in Colorado's courthouse as Leland P. Wall enters, another armed robber expecting decades, not millennia. Instead, the judge read out a number that made reporters glance at each other: 3,200 years. Wall had committed a string of violent robberies and kidnappings, each one stacking mandatory minimums under Colorado law. Victims described being shoved to the floor, tied up, driven around at gunpoint. Prosecutors simply aligned the statutes. Wall's expression barely changed during the reading, but the courtroom murmured through the final count. This wasn't exaggeration. It was arithmetic. Every hour of terror became a slice of time the state reclaimed. Number 15. A police radio crackles in Houston. 1 officer down, a community shaken. Carl Wayne Bunchen faced a capital trial after killing a patrolman during a traffic stop gone wrong. The jury refused leniency, and the judge imposed life without parole, a sentence designed to shut the door permanently. What followed was decades of appeals, psychological evaluations, and courtroom revisits, each confirming the original ruling. Prosecutors kept returning to the same point: an unprovoked attack on an officer performing routine duty threatens the entire framework of public safety. The courtroom atmosphere remained heavy throughout. The number wasn't decorative. It was finality in legal form. Number 16. A courtroom clock ticks loud enough to feel staged. Jeremy Joseph Christian, the man who sparked national outrage after attacking passengers on a Portland Max train in 2017, walked in already infamous. Prosecutors didn't waste words. They replayed footage, called survivors, and laid out the deaths of 2 men who intervened. The judge delivered the final math: life imprisonment without parole, plus 80 additional years for the attempted murder of a 3rd passenger and the terror inflicted on dozens more. Christian argued, ranted, interrupted. None of it moved the jury. The sentence wasn't symbolic. It was structural. When a public space turns deadly, courts answer with doors that never reopen. Number 17. A soft clink of leg irons hits the floor as Stuart Wilkin enters the South African High Court. Known locally for a string of brutal murders across Port Elizabeth in the 1990s, he listened while prosecutors reconstructed each victim's final hours. The verdict stretched out like a grim inventory. 7 life sentences, each tied to a different killing. South African law doesn't stack centuries, but the judge clarified the intent. Wilkin would never again be part of civilian life. Officers said he barely lifted his eyes during sentencing, as if disconnected from the room. But the families watching understood. The law had measured each life lost and answered in multiples. Number 18. Imagine the shuffle of a thick case file, page corners bent from years of handling. Lawrence Bittaker, one half of a notorious California duo, sat through a sentencing hearing that felt more like a memorial. Every victim's story retold in steady, clinical detail. The judge handed him 199 years to life, calculated through kidnapping statutes, murder charges, and enhancements tied to intentional cruelty. Prosecutors emphasized the planning, the precision, the complete absence of hesitation. When the final number came, no one gasped. It felt inevitable. The parole board would never see him. Some sentences aren't meant to expire. They're meant to ensure memory doesn't either. Number 19. A São Paulo newsroom falls silent as headlines pour in. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known for a lifetime of retaliatory killings, has been sentenced to 128 years. Brazil's legal system caps time served, but judges can still formalize the full weight of the crimes. His life story read like a chain reaction: grudges, confrontations, murders tied to personal vendettas. In court, prosecutors focused on the pattern, the ease with which he located targets, the lack of remorse, the consistency of violence. Brazil couldn't legally cage him for over a century, but the numeric sentence said everything. Sometimes time is symbolic, but symbols still warn loudly. Number 20. You hear it before you see it. The rustle of FBI agents' jackets as they take seats in the courtroom. Samuel Little, later confirmed by investigators as one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history, faced sentencing in 2014. California prosecutors built the case on DNA matches, confessions, and meticulously cross-referenced cold cases. The court handed him 4 consecutive life sentences, each tied to a homicide proven beyond doubt. As the investigation expanded, the FBI verified dozens more victims, but the legal outcome was already sealed. Little showed little emotion. Reporters showed plenty. The punishment wasn't meant to fit the man, it was meant to fit the devastation he left behind. Number 21. A metal chair scrapes across the floor, the only sound before sentencing begins. Luis Garavito stood before a Colombian court, facing evidence that stretched across regions and years. The law allowed a maximum of 40 years, no matter how many murders were proven, so prosecutors focused on clarity. Travel routes, discovered remains, timelines reconstructed with brutal precision. Families demanded more, but the code was fixed. Judges stacked aggravating factors until the symbolic total matched the scale of devastation. Garavito didn't react. Observers said he stared forward, as if the sentence were merely administrative. But Colombia read the verdict differently. It forced the nation to reconsider sentencing limits and what justice looks like when the truth exceeds the law's capacity. Number 22. A stack of legal pads sits beside the prosecutor, pages filled with timelines, witness accounts, and phone records. Ted Bundy had already turned his trial into theater, but Florida's court kept its tone clinical. In 1979, he received multiple life sentences, topped with a death sentence rooted in overwhelming evidence: bite marks, eyewitness IDs, and forensic links across states. He argued, cross-examined, smiled at cameras. None of it shook the jury. The judge described Bundy's total disregard for human life before finalizing the sentence. The legal weight wasn't about showmanship. It was about stripping a manipulator of control. Bundy's case became a benchmark for multi-state prosecution, proving charisma collapses when evidence stands taller. Number 23. A courtroom projector flicks on, illuminating maps of Washington state dotted with markers. Each point represents a victim linked to Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. In 2003, prosecutors secured a deal. Ridgway would reveal burial sites and confess in exchange for avoiding death row. The result: 49 consecutive life sentences, one for each confirmed killing. Detectives described the interviews as chillingly routine. Ridgway spoke in monotone while leading them to forgotten ravines. Families crowded the courtroom as the judge read the terms: no parole, no appeals that could reduce time. The sentence wasn't about numbers. It was about documentation, closure, and ensuring every recovered life had a dedicated line in the verdict. Number 24. You can almost hear fluorescent buzzing as Dennis Rader, known as BTK, is escorted into a Kansas courtroom in 2005. His case was built on letters he mailed himself, taunts to police that ultimately provided the clues needed for his arrest. Prosecutors chronicled each killing with photos, timelines, and forensic links. Rader, disturbingly calm, entered guilty pleas that stripped away any suspense. The judge imposed 10 consecutive life sentences, ensuring no possibility of freedom. Reporters noted how Rader described his crimes as projects, the courtroom collectively recoiling at the language. The final sentence translated that cold detachment into permanent confinement. Some stories end with a gavel, because there's no other acceptable ending. Number 25. A hush falls as Charles Manson steps into view, his presence still magnetic in the wrong way. California prosecutors reconstructed the 1969 Tate LaBianca murders, emphasizing that Manson orchestrated rather than physically committed most of the killings. The court imposed life in prison, originally a death sentence later commuted when the state abolished capital punishment. Testimony focused on leadership, manipulation, and the cult dynamics he engineered. The parole board repeatedly rejected his petitions, citing continued danger and public impact. Each hearing felt like revisiting a cultural wound. Manson's sentence wasn't long because of a body count alone. It was long because he turned influence into a weapon the law had to permanently neutralize. Number 26. The guard unlocks a door with a slow, metallic click, and John Wayne Gacy walks into an Illinois courtroom already carrying a national reputation. Investigators tied him to dozens of murders through excavation work beneath his house, dental records, and missing person cases that finally aligned. When sentencing came, the judge issued 21 consecutive life sentences plus a death sentence, later carried out in 1994. Prosecutors emphasized the methodical nature of his actions, the planning, the concealment, the double life he constructed. Families filled the gallery as each count was read, each one acknowledging a name that had been buried twice, first in the ground, then in the backlog of the missing. The sentence was structured so no legal loophole could ever soften the outcome. Number 27. The courtroom lights buzz faintly in New Mexico as James Delberto is brought before the bench. Another habitual offender expecting decades, not a millennium. But his record told a different story. A string of armed robberies, carjackings, and kidnappings stitched together over years of violent escapes and reoffending. When the judge delivered the total, 2,000 years in prison, Gilberto blinked as if the syllables hadn't fully registered. Prosecutors cited mandatory minimums, enhancement statutes, and the sheer number of victims terrorized. It wasn't theatrics, it was arithmetic enforced by law. Reporters later wrote that the courtroom exhaled only after the final count was spoken. The point wasn't lifespan, it was permanence. Number 28. A helicopter thuds overhead. Ironic, considering Vasilis Paleokostas once escaped prison via helicopter in Greece. Before the dramatic getaway, his court cases stacked up normally. Bank robberies, high-profile kidnappings, and a pattern of evasion that embarrassed local authorities. When he was captured again, the judge imposed life imprisonment plus 25 years, marking both the severity of the crimes and the audacity of his breakouts. Prosecutors highlighted the logistical planning behind each heist and the lasting fear among hostages. Paleokostas listened quietly. Those who knew him called him unusually calm for a man whose life revolved around escape. The sentence was a message. No stunt could outfly the law forever. Number 29. A Polish courtroom feels almost ceremonial. Wood panels, high ceilings, when Paweł Yatishin steps inside for sentencing. Connected to a series of brutal murders, his case was built on forensic reconstructions, witness testimony, and ballistics, tying him to multiple crime scenes. The court imposed life imprisonment, Poland's maximum, and emphasized that parole would be extraordinarily unlikely. Prosecutors described him as methodical and detached, traits that made the crimes exceptionally chilling. His expression barely shifted as the judge spoke, but families in the gallery reacted with visible relief. In Poland's system, life means decades of review, but the consensus was clear. Society couldn't risk a second chapter. Number 30. A file lands on the prosecutor's desk with a heavy thud. Felix Melendez, a man whose crime spree across Illinois involved armed assaults, kidnappings, and attempted murders. His sentencing hearing felt like unpacking a storm, each count revealing a new escalation. When the judge announced 1/500 years, the courtroom absorbed it in total silence. Mandatory minimums, enhancement clauses, separate victims, every rule multiplied the total. The sentencing order read like a timeline of terror reversed into accountability. Melendez showed little reaction. Observers noted he seemed resigned long before the verdict. The number wasn't chosen for shock. It defined the state's stance on repeated violent predation. Every act earns time, and in his case, time became impossible. Number 31. You hear the shuffle of armed police as Tariq al-Mansour is led into an Indian courtroom, an echo of the chaos tied to the Mumbai terror plots he was convicted in. Prosecutors laid out intercepted calls, weapons seizures, and movement across safe houses, assembling a picture of coordinated attacks that left the city on edge. The judge delivered a stacked sentence totaling over 500 years, calculated through anti-terrorism statutes, conspiracy charges, and enhancements tied to public endangerment. Every count was treated separately, each one representing a step in the chain that led to mass panic. Al-Mansour stayed expressionless, but the ruling landed like a warning. Some crimes aren't measured in decades. They're measured in the time a society needs to feel safe again. Number 32. Fluorescent lights hum as Yu Young-chul sits down in a Seoul courtroom, surrounded by detectives who spent months assembling a case spanning the city. His crimes, multiple murders carried out with chilling consistency, left investigators pushing through long nights, piecing together timelines from CCTV, fingerprints, and confessions that arrived with unsettling calm. South Korea imposed life imprisonment, the harshest penalty available after courts deemed the death sentence unnecessary given procedural concerns. Prosecutors emphasized his calculated movements, the way he blended into busy streets, the meticulous planning. Families lined the benches as the verdict was read. No parole, no reconsideration. A cell, permanently. The sentence wasn't just protective, it was preventative. Number 33. A Moscow courtroom sits in near silence as Alexander Pichushkin, known through headlines as the Bitsevsky maniac, listens to the verdict. Investigators linked him to over 45 murders, each traced through phone records, recovered belongings, mapped crime scenes, and his own chillingly detailed admissions. The judge imposed life imprisonment in a special regime colony, Russia's strictest form of confinement, ensuring near-total isolation. Prosecutors described the obsessive pattern, the consistency, the lack of hesitation. Pichushkin barely reacted. Observers said he looked almost bored, an unsettling contrast to the gravity of the moment. The sentence reflected Russia's intent. When violence becomes methodical, society answers by eliminating possibility. Every year, every appeal, every opening. Number 34. The clink of handcuffs echoes as Harvey Karenyan enters a Minnesota courtroom, an aging man with a violent history stretching back decades. Prosecutors assembled a chain of evidence, ballistics, victim statements, and timelines showing his movements across multiple states. His crimes were violent, predatory, and deliberate. The court issued 3 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never again see civilian life. Reporters noted how the prosecution focused not just on the acts, but on the pattern. A man who, when released, reoffended with disturbing speed. The judge emphasized public safety, victims' trauma, and the need for irreversible containment. Karenyan showed little reaction. The decision showed plenty. Patterns have consequences measured in lifetimes. Number 35. A Louisiana courtroom fills slowly, tension rising as Ronald Dominique is brought before the judge. Investigators tied him to a series of murders across the state through DNA matches, forensic tracking, and a confession that unfolded over hours. The victims were adults, men from marginalized communities, many overlooked until investigators connected the dots. When sentencing began, the judge imposed 8 consecutive life terms, driven by the number of proven murders and the cruelty described in testimony. Prosecutors highlighted his methodical targeting and the way he exploited social vulnerability. Dominique's voice stayed flat. Families in the gallery did not. The sentence sealed the case. Accountability in 8 lifetimes, with no door left unlocked.